Welcome to tonight's happy hour with Fernway Collective. Tonight we're going to be discussing the virginity myth with PhD candidate, mythologist, amazing human, Hannah Irish. Hannah, would you like to introduce yourself and your paper a little bit?
Sure. So yes, I am a PhD candidate in mythological studies at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I am on Fernway's board of directors. And this, the Virginity Myth, is the title for a paper that I wrote and presented at the Pacific Northwest Regional American Academy of Religion's annual conference last month. I'm not going to just read the whole paper to you because you're not here for that. But yeah, just something that I think a lot of us have some experience with. The cultural idea of virginity. Maybe you're familiar with purity culture, modesty culture. These are all interlinked cultural ideas that have a very large impact on a great many of us. And I got curious about the mythological roots of some of that. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight.
Perfect. So I think a good way to start is maybe by, let's define what do we mean by purity culture and what do we mean by virginity even? I mean, these are, I mean, virginity is a big word that we hear a lot, right? That everybody might have slightly different definitions for. But purity culture, I feel like, is a little bit more niche, that maybe people are familiar with it, but haven't necessarily heard those words together and know how to identify that. So how would you identify virginity? Let's maybe start there.
Okay. So the English word virgin didn't appear in English until the 14th century. And originally, it meant something along the lines of a woman who was free from any social or sexual obligation to a man, who was not bound to a man in any way. So a woman who is sexually free and therefore socially her own person. And that's the definition that we find when we talk about the virgin goddesses of Greece, specifically Athena and Artemis, but also Hestia. However, since its introduction in the Middle Ages by the church, especially concerning the Virgin Mary, the word has come to mean a person who has not had sexual intercourse. So a virgin is someone who has not had sexual intercourse. Virginity is the state of not having had sex, basically.
Perfect. Well, then that brings us to another question of how do you define sex? But I wanted to add to the Latin root, Virgo, which, we're familiar with that word, but in Latin was a maiden, unwedded girl or woman, but also meant fresh or unused, which is kind of how we still use it today.
Yeah.
Fresh and unused, which is great that we apply that to human beings.
Right.
But that's part of a later conversation.
Yeah.
And it might be related to Virga, which means like a young, like fresh shoot, like of greenery. Like, and that of course makes me think of Persephone, right? Like the fresh young shoots out of the earth, symboling spring and resurrection and all of those things. So So how do we define sex? How do we know if we're even a virgin?
Yeah, so obviously there are two major issues with the definition of virgin being someone who has never had sex. The first problem is that it is incredibly sexist. So there is a myth, and I'm using myth in the sense of it's a story that is important to our culture. In this case, however, it is not scientifically or medically accurate. And that is that the myth that the virginal status of a woman can be judged by whether or not her hymen is intact. And that's just absolutely false, because if you know a basic amount of female anatomy, and
Which,
how,
let's be honest, here in America, we don't learn about a lot of female anatomy.
so, all right, so real quick anatomy lesson. The hymen is a very thin, typically thin, sometimes it's not thin though. It is a thin layer of, it's not exactly skin, but it's kind of like skin in that it's a protective tissue.
Like a membrane, maybe?
Membrane, that's a good word for it. That is a little bit inside the opening of the vagina. And so
And we're talking about the vagina as the actual canal, not the region
the
that we
area, right,
refer to as the vagina, but is
the actual vaginal canal. And the purpose of the hymen is to protect, specifically in infants and young girls, it's to protect the vagina from getting anything inside it that shouldn't be there. So, think diapers. The hymen is protecting that situation. And, when little girls are learning about their bodies and they're starting to explore, the hymen is also a protection for that. And so the problem is this myth that the hymen can only be broken by a penis entering in for intercourse. And that's simply not true. There are some women whose hymen is torn during intercourse and there's a little bit of blood. However, really athletic girls, oftentimes their hymen will be torn just through regular activity if they play sports. There's a joke about horseback riding. It's a joke, but it's real too. So also depending on the thickness and the flexibility of a hymen, sometimes some hymens can be so thin once girls' bodies develop, because the hymen doesn't grow with the body. So as a girl grows, the hymen stretches, but it doesn't like keep growing proportionally. So sometimes it just tears, and someone might not even know it because it's not some like abrupt thing where there's any blood. So I'm sure we all are familiar with scenes in movies set in the Middle Ages where somebody gets married and the next morning there's a sheet dangled out the window with some blood on it. And that is
announcing to everybody,
yes,
that their bride was virginal. And
that's exactly. Yeah. So one, yes, they consummated their marriage. Two, the bride was a virgin when it happened. So in the 21st century, America, the fact that there's still this misunderstanding that whether or not a woman or a young woman bleeds the first time she has sex distinguishes whether or not that's actually her real first time. So that's problem number one, right? Because there's no anatomical equivalent for men. There's nothing that anybody can say anatomically, physically, biologically determines whether or not a man has ever had sex before. So this whole myth of the hymen has been used against women forever to judge. And if a woman was found not to bleed on her wedding night, the assumption was that she was not a virgin. And in many cultures, some not very far removed from us, the consequences for her could be death. Sometimes they weren't quite that serious, but in many cultures, in many time periods, if it was thought that a woman was not a virgin on her wedding night, then she would be stoned, was pretty common. So that's problem number one with this definition.
And I've read that because of this definition, that there, of course, as humans do, we have all sorts of ways to get around this and to ensure that it happens, right? I've heard tales of vials of pig blood that a bride's mother will give to her on her wedding night to make sure that she spills just in case.
Yep.
There's also fish bladders that young brides would fill with blood to ensure that they had some tangible evidence, regardless of whether they were a virgin or not, or,
Yeah.
whether they had had penetrative vaginal sex or not. So there were a lot of options for young women to prove that. And there's even I don't even want to advertise this, but there's a website now that you could go to and buy a kit for $30 that's called like an artificial hymen. So you could have that with you on your wedding night if you're worried about your partner. You know what I mean? If you're worried about the state of your virginity or of your hymen, that is still a service that is offered today on the internet that you could go and purchase.
Yeah, because there are still places in the world where they do want to prove that a woman was a virgin on her wedding night. So obviously it's very sexist, and come on, like, a woman's life should not be in danger over something like this. It just shouldn't be. But that's what happens sometimes. So the other problem is that this idea of virginity only applies to sexual intercourse, which is still commonly understood as vaginal penetration by a penis. Therefore, it's completely heteronormative. So for one, it does not take into consideration any, I mean, if we look, because I think sometimes we do in this culture, we kind of look at like the first time you have sex as a certain kind of coming of age moment, right?
Right. There's some like sort of like ritualistic pomp and circumstance around it.
Well, and there is an element of like, you have been changed. You are changed by this experience, right? You can't go back. You can't go back to having never had sex.
And it's not something that you can change yourself. It's something that in this heteronormative situation, that a man changes about a woman and takes something from her and takes a piece of her that she could never get back.
That is a big problem with purity culture, which we'll talk about later. But even if we're looking outside of the sexist issues, because a man will talk about losing his virginity. A man will talk about, the first time that he has sex. So it does, it requires two people. It's something that happens together. Of course,
at least two people.
Yes. And of course, hopefully consensually on all participants. But it's heteronormative.
I have to stop you there, because I'm going to just make a blanket statement that there's no such thing as non-consensual sex. And I know you know that, but I just want to be very clear to everybody. There is sex, which is a consensual act, and there is rape. There is no in between whatsoever, no gray zone.
Correct. Yeah. But so because you have this idea, this story that it's a coming of age moment, if real sex is only a penis penetrating a vagina, then first of all, side note, we'll come back to this, right? All of the other ways that you can be sexually intimate with someone, like, right? So come back to that. But as far as the heteronormative piece, what happens to same-sex sexual partners who, if there are two vaginas in the equation, are they just like forever virgins? They've just never had real sex? Like, pretty sure that is not going to be their experience. Same with, if there are a gay couple and two penises involved, they're going to know that they've had sex. They're going to have had an experience that changes them. And so,
and I think that we all, like, as like United States culture, can agree that sexual experience is not just penetrative penile to vagina sex, right? Like, and we all know that's the case, but still people aren't considered losing their virginity in many cases until they have done that specific act. Which maybe we should put a pin in this, but that's immediately making me think of purity culture, where a lot of heteronormative couples will have anal sex because they say, well, we haven't lost our virginity,
anal sex,
and we can still consider ourselves
sex,
pure.
Hand stuff, like they will literally
Mouth
do
stuff.
everything but, right? Like, they will do everything but vaginal intercourse. And that, of course, raises the question of like, well, why then is this idea of virginity so important if it really becomes like, right, like, you have the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law kind of thing, right? So it's like they follow the letter of the law. The penis has not entered the vagina. But pretty sure like that's not the spirit of the law. I'm pretty sure you can be just as intimate with someone without having sexual intercourse.
Well, and who's making these damn laws anyways?
Right.
Why do we have to follow them?
Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of like how we think of virginity. And those are some initial really problematic aspects with that definition of virginity.
Yeah, if y'all have a definition that you've heard or that you grew up with about what it means to be a virgin, feel free to let us know in the comments. I would definitely be interested to hear if people have different definitions. I know when I was growing up, it was penetrative vaginal sex. I also identify as a straight cisgendered woman, and that would be what a sexual experience would be for me. And so I know like that my viewpoint, especially when I was younger as a teenager, like was pretty narrow considering this, because I was lucky enough and privileged enough to be a heteronormative person looking for a heteronormative relationship. And so these rules applied to me and my relationships that I was seeking.
Yeah. Also, if anyone wants to drop in the comments a better phrase or a better term for this coming of age moment that's not just like sexual intercourse, so that it is non-heteronormative. I mean, we could just say sex.
I think the first time you have some sort of sexual experience shouldn't be as big of a celebration as the first time you have an orgasm. Like, that's when shit gets real, Like, that's what we should be excited about, because I mean, and this is a whole other conversation, but so many people still believe that the female orgasm is not true. I don't want to say myth, because myth doesn't equal false, but there's this narrative that the female orgasm doesn't exist because it's not necessary for procreation. And we all know that we only have sex for procreation, right? Hopefully you can hear my sarcasm seeping through the screen at you. But it's It's ridiculous. Ooh, we've got a few comments here. Growing up, sex was considered vaginal penetration with a penis, but only from outside source. Okay, not the penis from outside sources, Deb. You mean from outside your family. My mom's definition was more broad. Okay, that's a great point though, right? With our purity culture that we have here in the United States, I mean, purity has to have the same etymological root as Puritan, right? Puritanical.
Yeah. Well, and so within purity culture, we'll just jump there for a little bit. Randall, are you familiar with the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris?
I am not.
Or not? Well, I'm gonna go say you're lucky.
Because I didn't grow up in that culture, right, in that subculture.
Yeah. And before anybody thinks that I am throwing Joshua Harris under the bus, I will say he has recently recognized how harmful and problematic that book was, and he has made many public apologies, and he has pulled the book from publication.
So the only short Cliff Notes version.
Yeah,
Cliff Notes version of what that.
So basically, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. He wrote it when he was 21. He was a pastor's kid, and he basically said that you should only, you really shouldn't date. You should court. And you should only court with the intention
splitting hairs at this point. I'm just gonna say
court with the intention of getting married. And the idea of courtship was that like your family was involved. So it was really like you weren't
like a community kind of event, right?
Like community around this relationship because you were heading toward marriage. So you wanted like your family's support. And within that courtship, that there should be absolutely no physical affection. Hand holding might be okay, and like short hugs, but like you shouldn't kiss before you get married. And in addition, so obviously within that idea of purity culture and purity, we're not talking about the letter of the law with virginity. So the expectation was that there would be no sexual or physical intimacy prior to marriage. And he took it even a step further and brought in the ideas of modesty culture and emotional purity, both of which the burden landed on the women. So the idea was that men are the visual sex, and therefore women needed to dress modestly so as not to—
Where have I heard that before?
So as not to cause the men around them to lust or have sinful thoughts or to have any sort of temptation.
And I'm going to need to interject here and say that is almost verbatim English translation of the Quran, which states that women should dress modestly to avoid street harassment. And that is the only textual piece from the Quran that supports hijabs or burqas. It's all about avoiding harassment from men. As we know, men whistling at women on the street predates religion, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So then in addition to a woman's modesty, like her decision to be modest, being responsible for men's actions toward her.
Victim blaming. That's what we call that today.
He also talks about like keeping your heart safe and pure for your partner. So in the event that this courtship that you're in lead to marriage, you should only you should have been very, very careful about how much of your heart you gave away, because you don't want to give, your heart away to someone that you're not actually going to marry. So that's like the Cliff Notes version of the Cliff Notes version of I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
So like, how would you feel about Janis Joplin, like willingly saying like, take another little piece of my heart, baby? I'm really hard to not burst into song all the time, and I'm not doing very well.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that he was not a Janis fan.
That's interesting. On that note, I could use another beer for this conversation. Y'all come in the kitchen with me.
Yeah. So, one last issue with this whole idea of virginity is that it is foundational in our nationwide abstinence-only sex education movement, which
That's proven effective, right?
I was going to say, which, I think most of us know is absolutely not the right way to teach adolescents how to be safe and responsible with their sexuality.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we can also thank this idea of virginity for, lovely phrases like taking her V card or popping her cherry.
Ugh.
So
I like especially hate that last one.
yeah, it's pretty awful.
And
It's
then there
pretty,
was that band in the 90s called the Cherry Poppin' Daddies. And
oh, I'm not familiar
yeah,
with them.
I mean, the music's not bad, but the name is just horrific.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like
Lots
taking,
to unpack there.
yeah, right. Well, and like popping her cherry is explicitly like that's in reference to the hymen. So that's
Right.
obviously one-sided. Now, taking someone's V card can go either way, right? Like, and I've heard it used in reference to a guy's first time as well.
Same.
Yeah. So that's kind of, I guess, our like contemporary situation with the virginity myth. What I got really curious about though, and thus, wrote this paper about was the mythological roots of these ideas, because of course, we didn't just come up with them in a vacuum. So I would love to just briefly summarize a couple of different myths from the ancient Greeks, the ancient Hindu, and the ancient Jewish people. And I just need to give a little shout out directly from my paper, because these two little snippets that I quoted, I just think are really worth sharing. So, brief read. When considering these texts, it's important to remember that men are writing them. So, as Christine Downing reminds us, we are presented with men's ideas about female sexuality. Thus, as Kiesa Hill observes, it's apparent that what has been termed mansplaining in current culture has existed as a form of sexual dominance at least since the beginning of literary societies, if not before. Okay, so just really quick, I know we've like talked a lot about definitions of mythology in probably almost all of our happy hours, but specifically with these texts that I want to share, I'm defining mythology as cultural stories that carry deep, important truths, whether or not the stories are factual. So in this case, we can look at these texts from the Greek, Hindu, and Christian traditions as mythology. They are cultural stories that carry deep, important truths, and we're not worried about whether or not they're like historically factual.
And let me clarify, but when you say historically factual, we just mean like it doesn't matter whether the events in these stories actually happened, whether the figures actually existed, right? It's the power of these stories that it's carried with us. And I mean, even just in this conversation, we talked about virginity and what that looks like and what that means. And it doesn't matter if there's no scientific basis to back it up. This is still like a deep-seated cultural belief that we have.
Mhm.
And because when we get into like facts about mythology, it's really kind of all over the place and touch and go. So that's what we mean. It doesn't matter whether or not these gods or goddesses existed, but
Mhm.
what does matter is that people believed their stories and people acted as if these stories were true. And that's like the big thing, because like everything's arbitrary, right? Nothing has any meaning unless we assign it. And we could think of mythology like paper money. You can't eat it, you can't make it grow, you can't do anything except maybe use it to light your fire. it only has value because we've assigned value to it.
Right.
So I'll step off that soapbox and let you go.
Okay, so tell you two really quick Greek myths. And to keep them brief, I'm just going to include the details that have to do with the sexism of the idea of virginity. And also I'm including in this the sexism of ideas of fidelity as well that are often more a burden on women than men. And you'll see why these are kind of two sides of the same coin as I go through these stories. So, as the ruler of the Olympian gods, Zeus's many sexual exploits are widely known. Among the less well-known, though, is the story of Alcamina. According to Apollodorus's account, Alcamina is betrothed to Amphitryon, but there is a period of separation before their marriage. The night before Amphitryon returns, Zeus transforms himself into Amphitryon's likeness and beds Alcamina, making her believe that she's consummating her marriage. When Amphitryon gets home the next day and asks Alcamina why she's not giving him a warm welcome, she says, well, you laid with me the night before. Amphitryon then consults the prophet Tiresias, who tells him what Zeus has done. This is the end of Apollodorus's tale. And so it appears that Amphitryon believes that his wife remained faithful to him despite her physical act of intercourse with Zeus. So there's Greek story number one. Greek story number two, very well known, comes from the Odyssey by Homer. So after 20 years away from Ithaca fighting the Trojan War, Odysseus returns disguised as a beggar, and his wife, Penelope, and he set several tests for each other. Penelope wanting to prove Odysseus's identity, and Odysseus wanting to prove that Penelope was faithful to him in his long absence, which, let's face it, 20 years would have been really understandable if she'd assumed he died in the war and she moved on. 20 years.
Well, but then that depends on how do we define sex? How do we define cheating? How do we define abstinence?
Mm-hmm.
You don't think she thought any sexy thoughts in 20 years? Did she masturbate? Did she have a sexy dream? Where's the line here?
So,
I just have to put that
in this story, it's very much about the fact that she has been refusing suitors this whole time. So that is, yeah. So it's, yeah, she has kept all of the suitors at bay.
So it's simply the physical act of
so
abstinence.
In this
that
case,
word.
Yeah. Yep. So they test each other a bunch, right? And what finally proves each to the other is the bed test. Penelope tells Odysseus's nurse to move the bed that Odysseus himself built. Odysseus, furious, explains why it would be very hard, even impossible, for the bed to be moved, since it was built out of a living olive tree, which the bedroom itself was then built around. Penelope bursts into tears and runs to him to kiss him and explains that she was using the bed as a test, because no one else has seen the bed, so only he would know that the bed was carved out of a living olive tree and can't be moved out of the bedroom. And so this proves Odysseus's identity to Penelope, and also then Odysseus interprets this as meaning that Penelope has remained faithful to him because no one else has been in his bed, basically. So 2 Greek stories. 2 stories from Hindu mythology.
Wait, I have a clarifying question really quick about the Greek stories.
Mm-hmm.
That first interaction with Zeus, was that a consensual act of sexual penetration, or was Zeus out raping everybody, as he is wont to do?
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and say it was rape because Alcamina did not consent to sex with Zeus. She did consent to sex with who she thought was her husband, but I'm gonna go ahead and call that rape, which is what a lot of Zeus's sexual encounters are.
And that can be a whole other happy hour. If y'all are interested in hearing about Zeus raping all the women all the time, let us know. We are happy to, well, not happy, I'm not thrilled about it, but we're absolutely willing to talk about it and to share those stories, because there are so many. I mean, we could just do one story a night for a whole year and
Yeah, right.
still like barely be scratching the surface on Zeus.
Yeah.
So, Hera gets a bad rap, but I think I would classify that as like stealthing almost.
Yeah.
Like the same kind of idea as
In my
stealthing.
opinion, is still rape. Because
100%.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry if that was unclear.
Yeah.
The specific type, like, and for those who don't know, stealthing is when your partner has consented to have sexual intercourse with you with a condom on, and you remove the condom without their knowledge or consent. So that's what we're referring to, and that's kind of what it feels like. Zeus presented himself as somebody else and had that little bit of consent, but it wasn't consent based on all of the facts.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
There's an Arthur situation that happened like that, right? In Arthurian legend, wasn't there a Lancelot sneaking into Guinevere's window? Not to put you on the hot seat, because Arthurian legends aren't my jam.
I don't know of any versions of the story where Lancelot rapes Guinevere. But I also don't know all of them inside and out. So
maybe I'm thinking of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Oh Lord, I'm gonna lose my license to teach right now that I can't remember this. Deb said yes, that's right about Lancelot. Which is right about Lancelot, Deb? Which is it? Who's right? I remember going over a story where it was specifically in disguise as
Arthur,
a husband or something else coming into her bed, and I swear it was Lancelot and Guinevere.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyways, we'll put a pin in that and table it for later.
Yeah. Lots to talk about with the Arthurian legends, if we can convince Randall to do that. So if you're interested in Arthur and Grail stories, you should comment that, because it's going to take some convincing for Randall to host a night on that.
Because Randall effing hates Arthurian legends, and I will gladly go on record saying that Arthurian legends are all over the place. They're literally all fan fiction stacked on fan fiction stacked on fan fiction, and there's no real canon. Anything anybody says, what I just said about Arthurian legends, even though it might not have any textual evidence, would be considered canon, because there are no rules when it comes to Arthurian legend, and it's all romancing crap. Anyone who knows me, I'm not about the romancing crap.
Okay, I'm going to pull us back, because we are.
Yeah, please do, because this is making me annoyed.
Last third of the evening. Okay, so quickly, 2 stories from Hindu mythology. In the Valmiki Ramayana, Indra, the king of the Hindu gods, at least in some perspectives, rapes Ahalya because he is tortured by lust and full of anger. Her husband, Gautama, who is a revered ascetic sage, curses Indra, which is understandable, for an understandable reaction for a husband who just caught the man who raped his wife. However, then Gautama does something not understandable at all, and pretty messed up, because he curses Ahalya, saying, "You evil woman, get out of my presence and my hermitage. Since you are gifted with youth and beauty, since you who are gifted with youth and beauty have been loose, therefore you will not be the only one with beauty in the world. All creatures will have that beauty, so hard to get, which led you astray when you relied upon it." Ahalya was the first human woman, and thus the most beautiful, so she is basically punished by being made average. And
By being made average.
yeah. So Gautama like takes her like extra beauty away or something like that. Because he accuses her of using it basically to lure Indra, despite the fact that that's not supported in the text. That's what Gautama accuses her of, and thus says that it's her fault she got raped. So
Victim blaming.
yeah. The other story, real quick, is from the Hindu epic, the Ramayana. And in this, the Sita, Prince Rama's wife, is abducted by the demon Ravana and held captive for many years, during which he unsuccessfully tries to seduce her. Rama goes to war against Ravana in order to rescue Sita. However, he fears what his people will think of him if he brings home a queen with a questionable reputation. Though Sita tells Rama that she remained faithful to him, Rama still subjects Sita to a harsh consequence, literally trial by fire. She passes the test and Rama reinstates her as queen, but later he again doubts her faithfulness and banishes her. And in response to this, unlike the other stories, Sita does exercise some agency at this point because she chooses to disappear into the ground, forever free from Rama and the power of men in general. So those are our two Hindu stories.
And if anybody's interested in Sita, there's a really great video that I love called Sita Sings the Blues.
It's wonderful.
It's absolutely wonderful. I encourage you to Google that if you have a little bit of time and you like blues music and you're interested in Hindu mythology. I know it's a interesting crossover there, but it's
the animation is also beautiful. So yeah, lots of
it's all the music of Annette Hanshaw as Sita singing her blues music, and I highly recommend it. So really quick, I found the Lancelot thing. Lancelot was raped by a woman who was holding him captive.
Yes.
And then there was another time with the same woman who she like set up a fake sexual assault and had Lancelot like fight off the people in hopes that he would love her and want to lay with her. So I apologize for my confusion. It's been years since I've read. I don't even know how to say his name. Chrétien.
Oh, Chrétien. Yeah.
Chrétien. Okay, here we go. Yeah. His version of the Arthur myth, and that brings up a whole other conversation that we'll put a pin in. But it wasn't considered rape because a man's virginity wasn't the same thing as a woman's virginity. Not that Lancelot was a virgin, but
right,
he couldn't be defiled in the same way that a woman could, which we all know is BS, right? Like, yep. Men and other gender identities besides women can absolutely experience rape and sexual assault and unwanted sexual advances and sexual harassment. Gender identity, sexual preference, and orientation has nothing to do with it, to just be very, very, very clear.
Right. So just two more quick little stories from the Bible. Again, looking at the Bible mythologically as important cultural stories that carry truth for the culture. And of course, our American culture is heavily influenced by the Bible and by various traditions within Christianity. Whether or not you consider yourself a Christian, whether or not you think that you know much. I know Randall and I have had plenty of conversations where I'm like, oh yeah, well that's from, this church historian. And she's like, I did not know that. So it seeps in, even if you don't know that that's where it's coming from. So because of that, we have to talk about the Bible a little bit. So
yeah, we have to talk about, even if you are not Christian in the United States of America, we are a nation founded on what a lot of people like use this catch-all term of Judeo-Christian beliefs, but it's really a Christian belief system,
Yeah.
right? A Christian value system. That does have roots in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the Hebrew Bible, yes, but it's a specifically Christian interpretation of those texts, I would argue.
Yes.
Um, and that provided a lot of foundational cultural narratives for our country, for our culture, even if you don't actively practice that religion yourself, or even if your family comes from a different religious tradition. I mean, it's still considered like kind of non-denominational to like have Santa in schools, right? And
Mhm.
I mean, spoiler alert, Santa's not in the Bible, but it comes from this Christian tradition that we see as like the default, the norm, just like our like heteronormative relationships that we were talking about earlier. That's considered the default, just as Christianity is considered the default religion and the default cultural experience here in America. And so we have so many secular Christian traditions where you can decorate with bunnies and eggs for Easter, even if you don't celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. So um, even if you think the Bible, the Christian Bible, doesn't apply to you, if you are sitting here as a person in the United States of America, I bet it does.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
my little spiel.
So of course I mentioned her earlier when I was talking about the origins of the word virgin, the Virgin Mary, who in the Bible is Jesus's mother. And she, the mythology around her is that she was a virgin when she became pregnant with Jesus because she was impregnated by the Holy Spirit. And therefore she gave birth as a virgin because her husband chose not to have any sexual relations with her while she was pregnant. So there's a, well, okay, I'm doing this backwards. That's okay. So the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, says, before they came together, they being Mary and Joseph, before they came together, Mary was found to have been pregnant by the Holy Spirit, and Joseph, her husband, being righteous and not wanting to expose her publicly, wanted to secretly divorce her. In addition to saving Joseph from public humiliation, which he would have faced if people had found out that his betrothed was pregnant, a secret divorce would also save Mary from death by stoning, which we talked about earlier as well.
So can you clarify, why would a secret divorce save Mary from that?
Because at this point, well, so at this point, Mary and Joseph are betrothed. They're not technically married yet, but there would have to be a formal breaking of the betrothal. And if it was done in secret, where they kept the reason for it from being known, then Mary would not be accused of adultery, because essentially she's pregnant by someone who's not her husband, and she would be accused of adultery and she would be stoned, because that was the punishment for adultery.
So would adultery be worse than having a child out of wedlock?
Well, the idea is essentially that it would be viewed the same. So in the same way that a woman who gets married and is not found to be a virgin could be stoned for that, any woman who's found to be pregnant without a husband could be stoned as punishment, because she has not kept herself pure. She has allowed herself to be defiled, et cetera, et cetera. And in very few cases did, at least the stories that we have in the Bible, granted, they are not the end all be all of the history of, those time periods and those cultures. But what we do have from the Bible is that very, very, very rarely is there any recognition of it's never explicitly stated in these laws from what we call the Old Testament that there's an exception if a woman is raped or if it's incest. So I know we're all familiar with conversations about rape and incest as exceptions to abortion laws. We have stories in the Bible where rape and incest are, like, when it's found out that a woman has become pregnant out of wedlock due to rape or incest, then she is not punished and the man is. But there's nothing in these laws that say that that's going to be the case. So Joseph wants to secretly divorce her, but then God sends Joseph a dream explaining the Immaculate Conception, saying, after Joseph rose from his sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and he took his wife, but he did not know her until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. So again, Mary becomes pregnant as a virgin, gives birth as a virgin, because Joseph does not have any sexual relations with her until after Jesus is born. And then there is, so one reason, quick side note, that we are trying not to say Judeo-Christian anymore, is that Judaism is its own religious tradition. Christianity is its own religious tradition. Also, there are multiple traditions within Judaism, just as there are multiple traditions within Christianity. And the Christian perspective on the Hebrew Bible, what is called the Old Testament in the Christian Bible, is not the perspective of Judaism. So when Christians or Christianity or Christian thought talks about messianic prophecies, and they apply them to Jesus, that is distinctly Christian and distinctly non-Jewish. So I just want to make that really clear. So from the Christian perspective, one of the messianic prophecies that includes the virgin birth is in the prophetic book of Isaiah. Isaiah 7:14 says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the young woman will conceive and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. And there's a footnote in the One New Man Bible for this verse that says, referencing Deuteronomy 22:20-21, that the Hebrew word Alma means maiden or marriageable young woman, and in modern Hebrew means virgin. So again, we have that little bit of like, it didn't really mean exactly the same thing as it does now. However, the footnote then says an unmarried woman in Bible times had to be a virgin or she would be stoned. So even though Alma means maiden or marriageable young woman, there was still the expectation that she would be virginal on her wedding. And the verse from Deuteronomy that is referenced, Deuteronomy 22:20-21 says, but if this thing is true and the tokens of virginity are not found for the girl, which would be the blood on the bedsheet, then they will bring out the girl to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city will stone her with stones so she dies, because she has wrought folly in Israel to play the harlot in her father's house. So those are, I wanted to get through that a little faster so I could comment on it a little bit, but those are some myths from 3 different cultures that give us a little peek into this idea of virginity that we still operate with today in America, which of course is many, many, many miles and many, many millennia removed from ancient Greece, ancient India, and the biblical area, lots of different places. I'm like not really sure how to say that. Biblical times.
Biblical times, yeah.
However, so both the Greek and the Hindu stories predate the Christian stories from the Gospels. And there is lots of reason to believe, there was especially a Greek influence on the writers of the Christian Bible. But there's also a lot of reason to believe that there was crossover from India and other places in Asia. So the stories, people build stories on other stories from other cultures. You know, they things get combined and conflated and etc. So anyway, that's some of the mythological roots of the purity myth. And I would love to go into commentary on all of that on another night if people are interested, because boy, do I have a lot to say about it beyond just the stories themselves.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we do these happy hours as only an hour, but an hour is barely enough time to even scratch the surface of so many of this stuff. So if there's anything that comes up in any of these conversations that you'd like to know more about, let us know in the comments. We would love to specifically tailor any of these topics or any week's topics to what you want to hear about, right? Like, I mean, obviously we have a lot of fun having these conversations, but we really want to be of service to everybody who's interested, and to help share our knowledge of what you want to hear. I also wanted to mention really quick that there is a Greek god named Hymen,
Oh,
supposedly one of the sons of Apollo. Calliope is sometimes his mother, Cleo is sometimes his mother, Terpsichore. Some people say he's the son of Dionysus and Aphrodite and the god of fruitfulness. But he is known as the Greek god of marriage, whose name comes from a refrain of an ancient marriage song. And the first mention we see is in the 5th century. So it's really interesting that we have this word hymen that means membrane, or like sewing together, that comes from, or is the name of a Greek god as well, and way lesser known. I mean, that's something I didn't.
yeah, I did not
I've
know.
never heard of him.
I was a day years old when I learned about the Greek god Hymen.
The Greek god Hymen. There you go. Yeah, it's and that's like the blessing and the curse of mythology, right? Is that we call ourselves mythologists, and we have these advanced degrees studying mythology, and just like these 1 hour happy hours, our degrees barely scratch the surface of what mythology is and means. And it's a lifelong study.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sounding like real cheesy now, but
Well, but along those lines, one more thing to our audience. I think I speak for all of us when I say that we are not opposed to you asking us to talk about something that is maybe a little bit outside of what we consider ourselves experts on, because we are these lifelong learning mythologists. That's what we signed up for. So diving into something that we're a little less familiar about, totally something we're willing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have connections with people in other disciplines. I know, I mean, Hannah's background isn't just in mythology, even though that's what her most recent master's degree is in, and that's what her PhD is going to be in. The same with me. I've got degrees in archaeology, anthropology, religious studies, literature, liberal arts and sciences, whatever that means. And so we have a whole team of amazing volunteers here at Fernway Collective that have a wealth of knowledge in across disciplines. And we would love to come up with new topics based on what y'all want to hear. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for having this conversation. I really think we need to do at least a part 2 of this.
If people want to hear more, I would love to do a part 2.
Yeah, so let us know. Do you want to hear more? Do you have any specific questions? What does virginity mean to you? If you want to share with us how you lost your virginity, or what that situation looked like, or how you felt, and what that did to your soul. Did it feel like a piece of you was taken or missing? Does it feel like a piece of you was added? Did it feel like you came of age and you're part of a special club now?
It's super anticlimactic, and you were like, why does this get so much hype? That is also a totally valid option.
Because women don't orgasm when they lose their virginity.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert. I'm sure that I'm sure like we're gonna get somebody coming at us now that's gonna be like, well, you know, when I lost my virginity, like I did, and I hate that I'm still using that word, that language.
Yep, I know.
I didn't lose anything when whatever, when I had my first sexual intercourse. God, there's no good language.
I
And this was
know.
last week too. There's
Yeah.
no good language for what we're trying to do. We need to come up with better language to describe what the heck is going on with all of us.
Yep. So again, if you have ideas for better language, leave them in the comments. We would
Let
love
us know.
to.
Well, thank you,
Cool.
Hannah, so much.
Thanks,
I'm
Randall.
looking forward to hearing what people want to hear for next week. So
Yeah.
holler at us and let us know.
Cool.
And we'll see you all next week on Monday's Happy Hour with Fernway.
Bye,
Have a good
everybody.
night.